Sometimes an encounter with Jesus results in a healing. Sometimes an encounter with Jesus results in a miracle. Sometimes an encounter with Jesus results in being offered something that you could never have experienced otherwise. Sometimes an encounter with Jesus results with a confrontation of something inside of us that needs to change. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. Luke chapter 9, I'm going to read verses 51 through 56 if you want to follow along. When the days were coming to a close for him, that is Jesus, to be taken up, he determined to journey to Jerusalem. He sent messengers ahead of himself, and on the way, they entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. But they did not welcome him because he determined to journey to Jerusalem. Well, when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them, as Elijah also did?" But he turned and rebuked them and said, "You don't know what kind of spirit you belong to." That's what I want for us to hear this morning. That Jesus, in light of this question that two of his disciples asked him, the scriptures tell us he rebuked them and said, "You don't know what kind of spirit you belong to. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy people's lives, but to save them." And they went to another village. I find it interesting and not all that coincidental that the story we just heard from Caitlin this morning tells a little bit about some impressions she had of Christian people, of Christianity. She basically summarized it in the way that many people, unfortunately, would summarize it today, that it is a belief system largely followed by those who are judgmental, bigoted, often looking down on others that maybe don't believe in the same way they did. And so I'd like for us to just kind of sit with that this morning, along with this encounter that Jesus has with these two disciples. Let me just elaborate a little bit on what is going on in this passage, and then we'll talk about some of the principles that I think we can derive from it. First of all, Jesus is described here as having resolved to go to Jerusalem, and so he sends some messengers kind of ahead of him to, because as he's going along, he's making stops in various places. And one of these potential stops ends up being a place where the inhabitants of that village decide that Jesus is not welcome there, and we'll talk about a little bit about why that is. And the disciples, specifically James and John, have this reaction to the rejection that they experienced by these villagers, and amazingly ask this question of Jesus whether they should call down fire from heaven. Now, what they are likely thinking of is a story that they had grown up with and had become very familiar with themselves from back in the days of the prophet Elijah, who had this incredible ministry of speaking for God on behalf of God to God's people that included often the company of the king and the queen of the land. And Elijah, of course, happened to live at a time when things were very, very tumultuous between the God of Israel and the Israelite people themselves. And one of the escalations of that disconnect comes in the form of this story where Elijah looks at the people, the nation of Israel, and says, "Why is it that you are just sort of muddling about the middle of two opposing belief systems?" What apparently was going on was the nation, while continuing to kind of hold some degree of allegiance or affiliation with Jehovah God, the God of Israel, they had also, from time to time, flirted with the worship of other gods. In this particular story, the god of Baal. And Elijah says to them, if Baal is God, then worship him. But if God is God, then worship him. And as the story goes, he has this confrontation with the prophets of Baal that ultimately results in fire coming down from heaven, consuming a sacrifice and many of the people that were around. And so perhaps this image was in mind as, again, these disciples sort of experience the rejection of those that were, or at least that they saw as opposing Jesus. You'll notice that I put in brackets a couple of the phrases or sentences in this passage of Scripture. And the reason for that, if you're looking in your Bibles, you might find that that instead of these words being contained within the verses themselves, they are instead put as footnotes. And the reason for that, as those footnotes will explain, is because some of the manuscripts that we have available to us from which our translations come don't include these things, like the phrase, as Elijah also did, right? So that could be something that was written by Luke when he wrote the gospel and somehow it got dropped off in some of the other manuscripts, or perhaps it wasn't included in Luke's original manuscript and somebody along the way was just trying to clarify a little of like why they made this particular appeal and interpreted it as, maybe following in the footsteps of Elijah. But then the bigger kind of part, all of our translations are going to include Jesus' response, which is that he turns to the disciples and rebukes them. And then some of our translations, again, depending on which manuscript they happen to be using, may or may not include how Jesus rebuked them, what it is that he said, right? And those words are captured as Jesus saying to them, you don't know what kind of spirit you belong to. For the Son of Man, referring to himself, did not come to destroy people's lives, but to save them. And so that's a little of what's going on in the text. Now, let me just kind of dive in more specifically to what we're talking about, at least in terms of the timeline of Jesus' life and ministry. We might describe this as approaching what we could call crunch time, right? As the verse in verse 51 tells us, says, when the days were coming to a close for Jesus to be taken up, that is, we were kind of nearing the end of Jesus' earthly ministry and quickly approaching the time when Jesus would make his final trip to Jerusalem, where, of course, he would ultimately be captured, crucified, and laid in the tomb. And so what we're talking about is crunch time. Jesus is described as having determined. This translation, the CSB, uses the word he determined. That is, he resolved himself. Literally, the expression is he stiffened his face, right? Like have you ever had that kind of resolve to do something? Where you stiffened up, you hardened yourself. It was, regardless of what comes, I am going to do this. Well, that is sort of the attitude that Jesus was taking as he was readying himself to go to Jerusalem, where he knew what was going to happen to him. The days were coming to a close of this time that Jesus conducted his earthly ministry, including the development that was taking place within the lives of his disciples. And that meant that things were going to start moving more quickly than they had before. How many of you ever experienced something like crunch time where all of a sudden things start to move more quickly? Right? When you're playing a game in high school, college, or perhaps even more familiar than that, and you're nearing the end of the game, right? The clock, the minutes or the seconds of the clock don't actually tick any faster than they did at the beginning of the game, but it sure feels like they do, right? Because everything starts to really come more into focus. When you're nearing the end of something, everything starts to be magnified. Like it looks larger, and things are moving at a more rapid pace. Some of you have been around for a long time, right? I would consider myself to be in that category nowadays, right? Like I've been around a while, and I kind of, you know what I'm talking about, right? That, and we even talk like this. It's just, man, things are just moving so fast, right? And I'm not just talking about within the local particulars of your life, like, wow, my kids are all grown up. Now I have grandkids, or, it's like, how did that happen so fast, right? I mean, certainly, yes, that is our experience. But I mean, just even in the world, like things seem to be moving at such a more rapid pace. So much so that oftentimes it feels like an incredible, even insurmountable challenge to actually try to keep up. And the fact that we feel that is going to play into part of the problem that I want to address this morning, right? Because when things feel like they're moving more quickly than we can handle, what happens? We feel like we're out of control, like we've lost control. And what does that mean? Well, that means I feel more threatened. I get nervous. I get scared. I'm fearful of the future, right? It's far different from back in the days when things just kind of moseyed along. At this particular point, this juncture of Jesus' life, things are about to move very, very quickly, right? So that's what we're talking about. Now, who are we talking about? The main characters of this little interaction with Jesus are two men by the name of James and John. And you know who they are? They're disciples, of course. But they're really close disciples. Right? Like you read the Gospels, you find there's all kinds of people following Jesus, all kinds of people that might have considered themselves to be the disciples. And then there's the capital D disciples, right? The 12. 12 who most closely followed Jesus. But then even within the 12, there's the subset of 3. Peter, James, and John. You read the Gospels and you find they have some even more intimate experiences with Jesus when it comes to the actual following of Jesus. John, this is the Gospel of Luke we're reading. John wrote his own gospel. He wrote 3 other letters that we have as part of our scriptures. He wrote the book of Revelation. Like John he's a pretty notable guy. So James and John are part of what we might describe as the inner circle of Jesus. This is who we are talking about, right? These are not fringe disciples living on the outskirts, right? That maybe just they weren't close enough or didn't have enough direct access to really get who Jesus is, to really understand the person that they were following, to really have had the opportunity to assimilate into their own lives, into their own minds, into their own spirits, the nature and the person of Jesus Christ. They were as close as you could get. And so whatever we hear today, and I mean right now specifically to talk to all of you who are following Jesus, those of you here who would confess Jesus as the Lord and the Savior of your life. You're a Christian. You're a person that's following him. Whatever we hear today, we need to hear that no matter how close any one of us thinks we are to Jesus, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable to capture by a spirit that isn't Jesus. Let me say that again. Regardless of how close any one of us thinks we are following Jesus, we have a vulnerability to being captured by a spirit that isn't Jesus. I don't care how much you know. I don't care how long or how closely you think you have been following Jesus. I don't care how long, how closely I think I've been following Jesus. We're vulnerable. Now, this isn't just for religious people, though. If you're here today and you're not a Christian, listen, like there's a good chance there are certain convictions or beliefs that you have in your life. And let me tell you what is true about you that's true about religious people. Like when you have deeply held convictions and beliefs, you guard those. You hold them as sacred. And whenever you sense that someone is attacking those beliefs, there's going to be a tendency for you to want to make an enemy out of those attackers, right? So that goes for all of us. Let's see if we can uncover how specifically this reaction that James and John happened to, again, these two very, very close followers of Jesus. I think we might describe them as having fallen into what we have commonly come to know as the fight, fly, or freeze response. Right? So they encounter this village that essentially rejects and opposes them. Instead of welcoming them into the village and making a place for them to come and to share the work that they were doing, they don't want them. They don't want any part of them. And so now John and James, they perceive this village as opponents, as enemies. And this is what happens, right? When you sense danger, when you sense a threat, we fight, we fly, or we freeze. Well, I mean, they were on a mission, and so they weren't going to freeze. They had Jesus, who, in case you didn't know, at one point he had made a very, very dangerous, life-threatening storm come to a halt in just a moment. He multiplied a boy's lunch to feed thousands of people. He'd already showed that he was pretty tough in the face of opposition whenever he encountered it. So they weren't going to fly, right, because they had Jesus, right? Pretty brave when you got Jesus with you. So what did this leave? Well, it left to fight. What were they fighting? They were fighting something they perceived was opposed to Jesus. Let me, I took two of these verses and just kind of put them side by side so you can see the way in which it's described. Verse 51, Jesus determined, right? Remember that he stiffened his face. He resolved to journey to Jerusalem. Verse 53, but they, that is the village people, not the YMCA village people, that's right. The village people, they did not welcome him because what? Because, look at it, the words are exactly the same. Because Jesus determined to journey to Jerusalem. That's why they opposed him. Jesus had this purpose, and it was exactly that purpose for which this whole entire village rejected him. Now, just to kind of color in the lines here, you have to understand culturally what's going on here, which is you have Jesus and his disciples, who are all Jewish people, coming to a Samaritan village, and the Samaritans and the Jews did not have a whole lot of goodwill toward one another. In fact, it even escalated into the area of like religious life and understanding for both sets of people. And Jerusalem, for the Samaritans, Jerusalem was an especially sore spot. We talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago, right? The Samaritans, they lived in the area of the world where they felt like this is where it all began, right? They had some pretty holy places with regard to the history of God's people. And so there was this tension that existed between what the Samaritans believed was the right place to worship and what the Jews believed was the right place to worship, which of course was Jerusalem, where the temple was. And so I think the Samaritan village, if Jesus had, if he had aligned himself more with them rather than them just continuing to see him as one that was maybe there for a stop by, trying to convert them over to the Jewish ways or whatever, perhaps they would have welcomed them. But it was the very thing that Jesus had determined to do that created the rejection on the part of the village people. So this opposition couldn't be more direct. They're described as opposing Jesus for the exact purpose he determined. And so the question that James and John ask rolls right off the tongue. Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? Now look how easy it is for them to appeal to instant and grand divine retribution, right? These people reject them and Jesus. Look how easy it is for them to assume that these opponents of Jesus deserve to have fire from heaven fall on their heads. Listen, it's easy to bring the fire down when you think you're on God's side. Right? This is the problem. This is at the heart of the problem sometimes for those of us who are pursuing a life that follows after Jesus, that has grown to embrace certain beliefs and convictions. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the beliefs or convictions. It's not that there's anything wrong at all with them. The problem isn't oftentimes with what we know or what it is that we have made our allegiance to. The problem, as Jesus indicates here, is sometimes the spirit that we come to be captivated by. When we think we're on God's side, it's easy to think we are justified in calling down fire from heaven. But I find it interesting that they had apparently so much faith so as to do something like this, to call down fire from heaven, but that actually only showed how little faith they really had in Jesus. And let me just share with you what I think is a spiritual insight with regard to this, and that is that we have to be especially careful when the opposition feels the most strong. Listen, like I said at the beginning, when things feel like they're moving at a pace that's faster than we can feel like we're in control of, or when the opposition feels so heavy that if we don't jump in, intervene, and stop, the tide is just going to roll over us. When the opposition feels most strong, this is when you and I need to be more careful. And this is challenging. Because, again, our instinct, whenever we're threatened, and specifically I'm talking about when we feel like our faith is being threatened, when we feel like our way of life is being threatened. And how many of you here this morning, don't raise your hands, but how many of you here this morning, as you just consider what's going on in the world, as you think about how the movers and shakers are conducting their business and enacting, sometimes even legislating policies that fly in the face of what you believe or hold near and dear to your heart, and you perceive that as a threat to your way of life. I bet there's lots of us here this morning that often feel threatened by the way we perceive the world is going. And I would just contend that it is at that point we need to be the most careful, not that we relinquish our beliefs, not that we set aside our deeply held convictions, not that we become soft or wishy-washy on what we have come to embrace as God's revealed truth to our lives. What we need to caution ourselves on is whether or not we become captivated by a spirit that isn't Jesus. How do we respond to world events? Just in my lifetime, there's a couple things that seem to come up as very, very easy ways where religious people have been divided, and on one side, I think, have responded very, very poorly, and on the other side have responded very, very well. For instance, I grew up in the era of the AIDS crisis. And I can remember a lot of the rhetoric. I grew up in church. I grew up in a conservative kind of environment. And I remember the rhetoric by some that the HIV virus, it spread through illicit activity, and so therefore, if you contracted it, you likely deserved it. That was rhetoric on the part of some religious people. Others acted in a way to preserve life in saving efforts, or sometimes attended the sick and the dying with compassion and mercy. You had one kind of spirit that reflected the Spirit of Jesus, and you had one kind of spirit that did not. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated the city of New Orleans and the surrounding area. Nearly 2,000 people died, millions of people displaced, billions of dollars in damage. And again, I remember the rhetoric by some who professed to speak for God in declaring that that storm was the judgment of God on an area that had opposed him. Others put themselves in harm's way to save people and to bring relief. Again, one reflected the Spirit of Jesus and one did not. More currently, we understand that there is conflict and war going on in our world, right? And so when the conflict in Ukraine occurred, right, everybody established their sides. Most often, like, you'd see signs that said, "I stand with Ukraine," and Ukraine flags flying. And then more recently, this conflict begins again in the Middle East, again with the destruction and devastation of life, right? As terrorists go and attack the nation of Israel, and then the nation of Israel responds, and on this conflict goes to where more and more life is being destroyed. And again, what we find a lot of times, even with religious rhetoric, people establishing the sides that they're going to take, then defending their sides, and then justifying the suffering of those who are on the other side. And I would just propose that one reflects the Spirit of Jesus and one does not. I think the Spirit of Jesus, whenever there are things like conflict and war going on in our world, the Spirit of Jesus understands that the destruction of any life is a terrible, terrible thing. How do we respond to political events? Here we are, right? It's 2024. What does that mean? Another big election, right? People are drawing sides. The polarization just gets more and more, especially as we get closer and closer to the event. And there's the us, and there's the them, there's the me, and then there's the thee. How do we respond to these things? Whether it's candidates or legislation that's being passed. How do we respond locally? The homeless person or the beggar that we find, do we have this feeling that, well, they probably made some choices that landed them right where they are, and so they probably are experiencing the very thing that they deserve? That can be true. That can be true, that some people find themselves in that very, very difficult experience precisely because of certain decisions they made. That can be true. But at the same time that we can hold such an idea as whether that is true, we can also at the very same time have the wrong spirit with regard to not only how we think about that, but also what we do about that. How do we think about immigrants and asylum seekers? Again, we know that the issue of illegal immigration is a massively polarizing thing right now in our country. And you could have very justifiable and common sense policy ideas or whatever you want to call them, but at the same time, the wrong spirit in how you communicate and defend and employ those ideas. You see, again, if I'm talking to religious people, to Christian people, it's really, really, it's natural. It just comes very natural to us to think that Jesus wants the same thing we want, right? If I think about all the things that I want, it just comes very naturally to assume and to project on God that he wants the same things I want. And think that we have it the other way around. Think that, the reason why I want these things, or the reason why I understand things the way I do is because, that's how Jesus understands these things. That's how Jesus wants these things. And I'm just simply reflecting the desires of the God that I serve. But I find very interesting that Jesus' rebuke of James and John reveals something different. And that is, whatever spirit they belonged to, it wasn't the spirit of Jesus. They were inviting destruction. Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them? That was their question. They were inviting destruction. Jesus responds to them, I have come not to destroy life, but to save. Now, how do you decide whether or not you're going to remodel a house or take a wrecking ball to it and a bulldozer? Doesn't the question come down to whether or not the house has what we might describe as good bones, right? It's like, man, this is ugly, right? You walk around and everything's kind of outdated and in shambles, right? But then, there's some people that they just have this knack for kind of looking around and saying, oh, this house has good bones. Me, I'm wrecking ball guy. I don't see anything redemptive about stuff that is in utter disrepair. I can't envision what it would look like to not be in that condition of disrepair and to see it as something made new. Wipe it out, start all over, right? And this is why it's a good thing I'm not God. I mean, there's other reasons too, but that's a big one, all right? Some people, they look at this place and they're like, we can't tear this down. This has good bones. James and John, when they looked at this village, they saw bad bones. They saw something not worth saving. Their idea was scrap the whole project and be done with it. But Jesus saw something else, didn't he? James and John, they were focused on how the villagers opposed Jesus. Just like you and I, if we're not careful, we're going to focus on how the others, whoever the others happen to be, on how the others are opposing the things of God, the way of God, the desires of God, the plan of God. But listen, Jesus instead, he focused on how James and John were opposing Jesus. Jesus was focusing more on how James and John were opposing Jesus. It's like, guys, the spirit that you have, the spirit that has captured you, that's not my spirit. I didn't come to destroy, but to save. So let me close with, how do I seek to be motivated by the right spirit? So with the assumption that I am growing in my faith, I am becoming more mature in my understanding of the things of God. And with that, my allegiance to God and to what I presume God wants and what God envisions for this world is becoming more and more in line with what God actually wants and what God has in mind for this world. How do I seek to be motivated by the right spirit, the spirit of Jesus, regardless of how well developed my theology and my knowledge happens to be? The first thing I'd like to say or suggest is that we need to remember, every one of us needs to remember, that God doesn't need our indignation. Isn't it funny how, like, many of us, and listen, I've been guilty of this. I've spent years just guilty of this kind of thing. I go in and out of being guilty of this. There's a really good chance you might as well. Where somehow I feel like, I've got to have God's back. For some reason, I don't know, he just seems too passive. Right? Like, how's he letting all this, whatever your this is, how's he letting all this go along unchecked? What's he doing? Where is he after all? Right? And so I need to raise the level of my indignation and try to get everybody else around me on board feeling that indignation as well. But God doesn't need it. He doesn't need our indignation. A proper theology of God understands that God is perfectly just. Like, perfectly just. I know we think we're perfectly just, or at least pretty darn just. He's perfectly just. You know what that means? That means that God's wrath and God's love are never in competition or in conflict with one another. We have a hard time understanding that. But this ought to be actually very freeing for us. God doesn't need my indignation. When we revel in the destruction of others or the misfortune of those that we think are for the other side, we show how small our faith in God really is. Listen, again, this isn't weakness. This isn't being wishy-washy. This isn't lacking conviction. In fact, I think the deeper our convictions, the more careful we have to be not to fall into a spirit of judgment and destruction. It actually requires, as far as I'm concerned, it requires a bigger faith in Jesus not to give in to the fight response that would destroy others. Because it is there that we find or hold with faith that Jesus, he knows what he's doing. And then I would just close with this. How do we grow more into assimilating the spirit of Jesus and not some other spirit that opposes Jesus in our lives as we are maturing as Christian people? I just recommend you can learn anything from YouTube, right? Right? Can't you do anything? Like, YouTube has a video. It has a tutorial. And just like you can learn to do anything from YouTube, you can learn. You can learn to live like, you can learn to act like, you can learn to reflect Jesus from the scriptures. When you read stories like this, and you find the way a reaction came so naturally to people who were following Jesus, you find that juxtaposed against the reaction of Jesus. You learn something. And to the degree to which we're willing to assimilate the Spirit of Jesus into our lives, we can from the Gospels, we can from God's revealed word to us, we can from our investigation into who is the God of the Bible, we can learn to live like, we can learn to act like, we can learn to reflect the Jesus that walked this earth, that brought sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, who was not only a miracle worker, who not only did signs and wonders in nature and within the lives of individual human beings, but demonstrated the degree to which he is willing to go to seek and save those who are lost. So Jesus, give us more of your Spirit. As we are growing closer to you, help us to learn more what it means to embrace the Spirit of Jesus. Let us bring that into this world. Yeah, this world that feels like it's wildly out of control and just rife with chaos. Yes, this world that oftentimes seems like it's headed in a direction or has an agenda that is different from mine, and what I would assume is different from God's, that is electing leaders and enacting legislation that I consider to be a threat to what would be a more comfortable way for me to live out my religious devotion to God. Yes, even in that world, Jesus, help me to have your Spirit. Help me as I encounter the faces of people right here within my life who I find it very difficult sometimes to have a conversation with or to come to terms with. In those moments, Jesus, help me to have your Spirit that doesn't look forward to their being shown to be proved wrong, that doesn't look forward to their quote-unquote destruction or their difficulty or their getting what they deserve. But instead, Jesus, help me to have your Spirit. Amen. Can we stand together? The band's going to close us out with this song. Lord, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. The song says, I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all, and you still call me friend. Listen, we stand here all over the place, at varying places in our lives, following closely to Jesus, following from afar, or perhaps not even following at all. But I pray that, like, these moments that we share together will help us just to have the ability to see into this Jesus that we proclaim week after week after week, his desires for our hearts and our lives.